heard about the many challenges facing people leaders across the country, from AI to talent retention, from DEI to empathy. But as we discuss the creative and innovative ways to address each of these, there's one question left. What's next? And what new challenge is around the corner? And how do we prepare ourselves for it? How do we ensure our company is adaptive? How do we cultivate a future-ready work culture, which happens to be the name of our final panel? So I'd like to introduce our final panelists. Daniel Fuster, here on my left, is Head of Human Resources at the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. And Perry Timms is Founder and Chief Energy Officer. Founder and Chief Energy Officer, I love it, at People Transformational HR. Welcome, Daniel, and welcome, Perry, to the FT studio.
Thank you, Isabel.
I wanted to start off by asking you both a very general question. You know, what is the biggest challenge in the workplace that you're seeing at the moment? I'm going to start with you, Daniel. I know it's a very general question, but can you drill down onto one thing?
Thank you, Isabel. That's a very interesting question, actually. I don't think we can talk about one challenge. I think we have several challenges that are coming pretty quick at us. You were mentioning about discussions that you've had today during the different talks that you've had in this event about AI. Of course, that's undeniable. It's accelerating change in the workplace. It's accelerating the way that we work, and I'm sure that we will speak about it. I would say for us in OECD, we've also identified geopolitics. Climate change is also going to be a big challenge for the workplace coming on. Misinformation and also the amount of information that we have available to do at work on a daily basis. And finally, also that encounter that we're having at the workplace, especially after the pandemic, of values and culture in general, and what people expect of bringing their whole selves to work, and how do we manage it to make it an effective and productive workplace.
Thank you. Perry, what about you?
I'm really glad Daniel went first, because that is just the list that everybody's grappling with. But I will go with one, Isabel. I think the big challenge is intensity. Everything feels so intense, and it's not just pace, it's complexity, it's everything coming all at once. But I think what's building that level of intensity is actually a couple of pathologies that we've got. And one pathology is the pathology of greed when it comes to economics and so on. And the other pathology is the pathology of power, and how that is actually being either gripped more tightly or dispersed. And that's creating an intensity in terms of challenge as well.
So I wanted to say to the audience, as we're going to chat here, but do send us your questions or your thoughts on what are the biggest challenges you're facing, and we'll try to answer them as we go, but there will be time at the end as well. So sticking with you, Perry, I know you particularly work with a lot of kind of cutting edge organizations. What are the sort of the trends at that end of HR? Perhaps some people might say that's a bit out there, but that'll be coming down the pipe in a few years for most people, won't it?
Well, I think to Daniel's point about the range of things we're having to tackle, change management is vastly different now from what it was even 5 years ago. So what I'm seeing is people not thinking about change as a program, but as a constant and almost splicing change into what they would call business as usual. Now that adds complexity, because it's not a team that you can regulate and put a frame around. It's kind of everybody. So I've called it people-powered change, because that's what it feels like. And you touched on some of the other things, Isabel, in your introduction. Agility, that's gone from a buzzword to a must-have, but people are still like, how do I create an anti-fragile, adaptive organization? Then it's kind of different from how it was before. So I'm seeing the kind of surge, I suppose, of dynamic organization design. We have to reshape and adjust as a kind of regular occurrence rather than an episodic 5-year strategy. So HR is having to deal with the kind of people aspects of that. Where do people sit? Who do they report to? How do we allocate workflow? Most importantly, though, what skills and capabilities do we need next? Because we might have some now, but what do we need to emerge into? So those are the HR challenges I see.
Yeah, and Daniel, how do you see change as is it a constant or is it a strategy?
Well, I think that by now we can say that change is become a constant and not necessarily a strategy anymore. There is no more the alternative to choose if we are going to have to grapple with change in any type of field, in any type of sector. And I think to Perry's point, some of the challenges of dealing with change have to do also with the way that we tell our people what they need to do to be successful. So it's no longer a matter of getting a CV and seeing that you're an expert on X or Y field, that you went to X or Y school. Is how do you harness the competencies to deal with that change in an agile manner and to move from one aspect to the other, to deal with failure sometimes, because to deal with change also means to try things and to also fail at them and then learn and reintegrate into what you do every single day. And that is across every single field. It doesn't matter if you're an expert in tech, it doesn't matter if you're an expert in health. It's becoming more and more prevalent in the workplace regardless.
That's interesting. And do you think we're getting better at dealing with failure?
I don't think so yet.
Is that your experience?
I'd agree. I think there's still a stigma to failure. And I think there's something about how we can create safe failure that we haven't quite yet grasped. And that's containing experiments. But we talk a lot about evidence, don't we? I mean, OECD exists really to help us with policy and evidence. But I think evidence also comes from experiments that are contained, that can probe the future and prove a pathway is worth following. And if not, you don't go that way anymore. You adjust and adapt, don't you? So it's that.
So, Daniel, I wanted to ask you, you've been in the corporate world for a long time. What's the biggest shift you've seen in that time, and what shifts are to come, do you think?
Well, there's plenty of shifts that I've seen during my career, but let me start with the HR function for an example, since we have a lot of HR practitioners in the audience, maybe. So when I started my career almost 25 years ago, HR was still in the admin phase, is what I would like to call.
Personnel.
Correct, personnel. We were more in the field of supporting the business, running the payroll, making sure that people got their performance done in the system, et cetera, et cetera. Then I've seen that we've evolved into a stage in which HR has become more of an enabler, and many organizations are already in that stage in which HR becomes a business partner, and thus the creation of HR business partners that are embedded in the business and understand the business and work with the business on a daily basis. And slowly but surely, that has been underscored by a current of the use of data for decision making in HR as well, and technology adoption. I think that the next stage for HR, as we grapple with all of this change and with all of this, is to gain more and more a seat at the table, so that we're not considered a support function, but rather part of the business, which is what we are ultimately, because people are at the heart of what organizations do in all fields of expertise.
Right. So I've written a lot of stories suggesting there isn't enough people expertise at the top in companies, around the top table. Is there any sign of that changing, Perry?
I think there is, because if you talk to CEOs and we see surveys on a regular basis in this regard, talent is an enormous challenge for them. Both the acquisition of talent, because it's a competitive market for certain skills, and also then the retention of that talent once you have the right kind of acquisition strategy. But then, to me, it's all about the deployment, the development, and the versatility that comes from that talent. That's still quite an immature board-level discussion. Now, what I'm seeing from the people profession is we're stepping more strongly into fields like strategic workforce planning and the data that Daniel talked about. And that data is not just basic data on people. It is performance related, it is capability related, and it is even starting to touch on things like emotional intelligence and the ability to respond in crises, because then we can start to go, where do our people need to be at crucial times? And it's that dynamism I talked about.
Yeah. So we've already got a question. What's your advice for dealing with toxic culture? And that perhaps feeds into what we've just been talking about, HR at the top table, because a lot of companies can be derailed by a toxic culture that the CEO may not realize. How can HR professionals help to deal with toxic culture? Is it talking to the leadership?
Well, I think from my point of view, it's very difficult to create a silver bullet to solve all of this. If it were, this wouldn't exist anymore in organizations. But some of the things that I've seen successfully weed out this type of problem include, first of all, tone from the top, of course. Your organization has had to have a will to want to live values, live protection for people to feel safe at work. And it starts with setting tone from the top. Then come principles and a framework that is known and communicated to everybody, followed by safe spaces. And it doesn't have to only be HR. It has to also be, if you can and you can afford, having an ombudsperson or maybe having an ethics officer that can help you create those safe spaces for people to come and present their concerns. And then finally, there's accountability, which is people need to be reassured by seeing, by example, that there is little to no tolerance when incidents occur, and that actions are being taken by management to weed out, to, as I was saying, to eliminate this type of toxic environment in an organization.
That's interesting. So Daniel touched on a sort of independent ombudsman type thing there. Is that something you're seeing? Because with the best will in the world, some employees don't trust HR, do they?
No, and I think HR's got this real dilemma of where it leans. And I think it's lent very strongly into business latterly, as you rightly pointed out, because I think it had to create influence, to the point that then people in the organisation are a little bit mistrusting of that because they see them leaning into the business. But I think the ethics argument that you talked about and the emergence of ESG, environment, social and governance, gives HR a chance to go, this is bigger than just board and bigger than just profit, right? So I think we can make representation there. But I think there's something about that, as you say, ombudsman role. I think HR has the right to talk truth to power now and say, if you do not get this right, it is economically damaging for us, because we've seen companies who have imploded because of culture. And so we know the trail of evidence is there, and it's our responsibility to hold that space.
I wanted to just shift it a bit. We've mentioned agility in this. I have been writing about this area for a long time. I still don't really understand what agility is. Perry, could you enlighten me?
I can. So I often talk about agile as a small A and a big A. The small A is that we are responsive and adaptive. So we have kind of looser structures that are a bit more mercurial than they are steel-like, right? But then the big A, agile, is where we've got methodology, where we can adopt a product orientation to solving a problem. And that sounds a bit odd for professionals to create products, but we've got products all over the place: apprenticeship schemes, policies, maternity leave, career paths. So we take a product approach and we think very different about people's experience within it and including them in the process. I think the crucial thing, though, Isabel, is to remind us what Daniel said about failure in bursts and value creation in iterations. Those are the things that HR's not had a good, strong reputation in the past, but is starting to emerge into that. So working in sprints, involving people in the design, quick test and learn before we then go and release something new. And then that's, I think, what the agility piece looks like.
Thank you. That's a very clear explanation. So we've gone some time without discussing AI in any great depth. It's been in the news this week very much.
Oh, crikey.
Daniel, what is the role of AI? I mean, just on a very practical level, is rollout of AI just going to fall to HR people and, reassuring a worried workforce? But on a more macro level, how is it going to impact the work of HR professionals and work generally?
So I don't think that this is only an HR problem. I think that it's so big and it's so fast that it will impact every single part of organizations regardless. And I would like to invite people hearing us to take a look at our 2023 Employment Outlook report on the OECD, which takes a look at our 38 member countries and the impact that we found thus far in terms of AI and its integration into the labor markets. Now, I think that it's not a question about how or where AI is going to hit us. It's a question of how we're going to adapt quickly to the progress of this type of technology. And there are two, and this report is super good in this sense. There are two waves that are opening up in terms of opinion on the public. One, people that are adopting the old Luddite approach, in which they don't want to see jobs destroyed and they are doubtful of our AI, and others who are very quickly thinking about their jobs, thinking about their skills and functions to see how they can actually amplify their skills through the use of AI. I truly believe that that's the future, Isabel. I'm an optimist in terms of technology adoption, not without reins. I think that there are risks, that there are troubles that can be brought, biases that we have to weed out from AI because of the base data that it feeds from, and always a human in the loop is what many say, and I couldn't agree more. But on the same token, I think that this type of technology can actually pervert the way we work for better good of the world if you work for an organization like mine that is doing better policies for better lives.
Are you a technomist?
I'm with Daniel on the whole sense of how it can augment what we do, but the caution is absolutely right about bias and about over-reliance and so on, so the human touch is still absolutely vital. But my sense is there are so many large issues to solve, information being one of them. We cannot do it without some augmentation. I think there's really something about people fearing, will AI take my job? I think the answer to that is not necessarily. But will somebody who can leverage AI replace me? Yes. So we've got to lean into it and we have to be participants within it. It's still like a child in terms of technology. It makes mistakes and it's clumsy. That's where we can add sophistication and maturity. But make no bones about it, we are absolutely needing to develop new capabilities super fast in order to make this work.
And just as a piece of general advice to people watching, how can they prepare for the rollout of generative AI in the workplace? Daniel, is there anything you've been doing internally to
Yes.
help people?
Well, first of all, my own personal piece of advice is nothing replaces a critical mind. So any and everything that you try and that you expose yourself in terms of Gen AI, look at it with a critical mind and don't take it face value, because that is going to probably be a recipe for getting into trouble. I think that organizations in general, including the OECD, are quickly developing internal guidelines about how we expect our people to interact with this AI developments. And I think that's a crucial part, being clear with the communication with people about what you can do and you cannot do with AI. There's a lot of very important and sensitive information that organizations hold about their staff. AI and the publicly available models of things like ChatGPT is not the place to put the information that is sensitive to your company. There will be developments internal to firewalls, internal to this infrastructure of IT of your own organization that probably very quickly will get there, but not right now. So I think, going back to the general point, developing clear communication and the guidelines for your people on how to interact with AI is a first and crucial and practical step.
Perry, are you finding that, obviously that's best practice. Are you finding many organisations are doing that yet?
Not yet. They're starting to. And I think you're absolutely right. The concern is about privacy and security. So therefore, people are being really tentative. Now, the HR technology vendor community are all over it. It is AI everywhere. So, but there is, I think, a stress test to that, because we shouldn't just over-rely on vendor solutions. We've got to be part of the conversation about how do we use that. So I think there's something about how we can create more experimentation, again, safely for this. But people's propensity to learn is always there, so we need to tap into that. This is a great way for people to accelerate their digital literacy, not get further behind. That's my sense. The co-pilot thing we've not seen before. This could give people digital capabilities really rapidly compared to how they've been used to using them. So that, again, is something to watch for.
So we touched a little bit on talent retention strategies. Perry, could you expand that a little bit? Are there any easy wins for people watching in terms of recruiting and retaining the best people? Because it's quite a hot market. It's not showing any signs of becoming less difficult to find the right people, is it?
It's hot in certain areas, isn't it? There are high demand, and those are absolutely overheating. And then there's almost like an hourglass kind of situation where there's then lots of other ones where people are kind of there's more people than there are the roles. So I guess, what do we look at? I think some of the crucial things that we should bring into our sort of everyday being and the culture that Daniel talked about, recognition is still a little bit either tokenistic or mechanistic. And I think we need this more active form of recognition, because people get a real kick out of being recognised. So that's an easy thing to do, because you don't have to engineer it. It's a habit to form.
Would that be from a manager or something more formal?
Across the board, I think, because peer relationships are really strong. When I talk to people in all levels in organisations, I often kind of ask them, what is it that keeps you doing this job? And they say, that I know it adds value, I make a difference, but that people recognise that and support me. Those three things are the secret sauce. On top of that, people like choice and career paths that perhaps are determined by them. And there's no doubt that supportive management and strong visionary leadership are key things for people to stay put because they believe and they feel they've got somebody who's looking out for them. So those things are not going away in a hurry at all.
So a bit of praise goes a long way.
Oh, massively so. Yeah.
Daniel, what would you add to that?
I think that was a brilliant answer, Perry. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's very difficult to top that, but I would add on top of it. Yes, people are demanding more and more, not only a good pay, but also working in something that really lives their values and that doesn't necessarily only work for the bottom line of a company, but also for their own sense of what they're leaving into the world. And we're seeing more and more people gravitate into these type of jobs and creating that environment in which people feel that they're building into something bigger than them. It's important, regardless if you're a small company or a big company or a public international like we are. I think that also a sense of accomplishment and thankfulness that Perry was saying, that's very important. And it comes into high contrast sometimes with the vertical structure of some of the hierarchical organizations that you may be out there. And it's always sometimes as simple as recognizing a job well done. And finally, the other thing that I would like to add is career pathing. So what are the possibilities in front of me?
Yeah.
What can I do within this organization? Because people now have choice. As of May, 4.8% unemployment rate in OECD countries. This is a very hot market. It's a market where people are competing for talent. So retaining the best talent possible is also telling them what they can achieve and where they can go with their careers within an organization.
He topped that beautifully, didn't he?
He did.
Well done.
So I've got a question here. How do you envision HR or people departments evolving over the next few years? Daniel, I mean, we touched on AI.
So I think that first and foremost, we need to start from a point in which HR starts to evolve also to be less HR driven. Because I think that sometimes we like to look ourselves in the mirror and talk a lot about our lingo, a lot about the way we see things and the way that we would like to structure things. And I think that we need to start listening more to people, not only business leaders, not only your budget structures and your work plans, but also what people are saying. Things like engagement surveys that are now very prevalent in the workplace, or well-being surveys, are some good examples about how HR is evolving now towards that people and culture modeler. Not that HR is the owner of culture. It's a support and enabler function. That's one thing that I would say. But at the same time as we do this, we have to understand what are the drivers of the organizations that we work for. So understanding that those drivers need to be aligned to culture for us to be effective is a key parameter. Otherwise, whatever initiatives we may put in terms of pay, and then we can take out the lingo about compensation, benefits, and all of these things that we like to talk about, are going to fail as they've failed many times before. And all of that underpinned and accelerated by the incorporation of technology, not in a central manner, but in a very dispersed form across the organizations.
Oh, so that's quite existential.
Yeah.
What is HR if it isn't what it is at the moment? I mean, how would you define the future of HR?
So I think with the technology that we're talking about, there will be a lot of the sort of baseline administration automated, and people get very comfortable.
Will that go straight to managers, do you think?
There'll be some of that.
Yeah.
There'll be some of the sort of scripted stuff that we've been saying, which does liberate HR then to do something that perhaps might surprise people. And where I see HR teams being perhaps most impactful is where they're coming up with creative solutions that nobody expects. Like, wow, HR did that. I thought we had loads of rules that box that in. That makes a huge difference. And then the agility piece that we talked about, which is where HR can flex and be so responsive across value chains, employee life cycles, turbulence, problem spots. HR could model just how to be as a function that's responsive to that, and then trickle that through the rest of the organization to get that de-stratification that you talked about, so that then when problems hit us as an organization, we're ready for it. Now, so creativity and that responsiveness, I think that would make a huge difference to us.
So Daniel mentioned that HR is not the sort of keeper of corporate culture, but should it be? Who is?
I think it's kind of everybody's, isn't it? Culture is almost like a sort of energy force that you can't really just sort of say one person conducts that. So I think there's something about the narration, perhaps, and the evaluation of it that we can happily stand in that space. And I think when we think about stories that matter, when we think about data that gives us wisdom around culture, we can happily stand in that space. But it's everybody's, really.
Yeah. Is there a danger that HR gets too associated with the negatives? You know, whenever there's a scandal, often the HR people take the fall. Is there a way in which, you know, organisations are moving towards being more people focused in a much more positive way? Daniel, are we seeing that?
Yeah, I think that movement has started a long time ago. I think from 5 years to now, I've seen that wave kind of turn. The pandemic was a big accelerator, I think, of this process for HR. I think that HR was reevaluated in organizations, but all that it had to deliver during the pandemic. And now I think that's a place that we need to keep. I think the days where we were policing around, I mean, it's not that that doesn't happen, but it's becoming less and less prevalent because it's being replaced by other things that are needed, other things that are desired by the organization. And going back to the point that Perry was making before in terms of culture, I would add that where we can, as HR, add value is being the principal champion and supporter of good culture. And that is by doing the right advice, or giving the right advice rather, on how to put systems and processes that craft that culture around the organization, and convincing leaders to give that tone for the top that then can be espoused and lived by everybody else.
Thank you, that's great. I've got a question here about, can you give some insight on introducing intentional change to shift organically driven cultures and making that a constant principle of growth, which I think sort of aligns with my next question, which was around how can HR drive innovation in companies? I mean, are a lot of companies just organically driven, kind of mucking around down
I
there?
would agree with Daniel. I'm seeing more of that. I'm seeing more of the deliberate attempt and execution of people-centric practices, listening and shaping, and a degree of accessibility perhaps to key pieces of work that do strengthen culture in that particular regard. I think innovation has always been a real hot potato in organizations, because we've seen people try and create innovation hubs and units, and that hasn't worked. And then they've said, well, let's just disperse it then. It's like, well, how do I trap it? And I think the answer to that is that we see it all the time. People in customer conversations, people in colleague conversations, there's innovation that kind of bursts out there. We've got to create the infrastructure that captures it so that we can then use that to say, this is how we shape, this is how we organically adapt. So that feels like it's got some kind of quantum force to it, because it's renewable. So it's messy, but it's also very coherent. Do you see what I mean by that? So I think let's stop having program offices and innovation days and just bring that into our norms. Then we'll see positive change.
So to add to that, I think that Perry mentioned before about usually how organizations have structured themselves in boxes and org charts and all that. And maybe that is necessary still for budgeting and for planning and for a lot of things. But it's how you work in between those lines that brings innovation. For example, creating clusters of teams that are cross-functional, from unexpected places. If you have operations with corporate people and vice versa, that's an idea. Also, trying to get people to gravitate outside of job descriptions, I find, and more into skills, and then that those skills and that talent flows into business needs, regardless of reporting lines, et cetera, I mean, consulting firms had a lot of experience in this sense in assembling and disassembling teams regarding business needs. And then finally, one thing that I think I've seen in my career that really drives innovation is just putting needs out there for employees to raise their hand. And I want to contribute to X, Y, or Z, and I have additional capacity to give more. That helps a lot if you do it in a structured manner.
There's a London Business School professor called Gary Hamill who talks about participatory organisation. It's exactly that point.
Is that about sort of thinking differently about how you create project teams, and how do people come for it? Has tech helped us in that way? things like Slack help us to find each other in big organizations? Because I often wonder how those are best used. They can be very toxic, but they can also be incredibly helpful. Have you seen any examples of great practice with workplace tech?
So in my experience, I think a big turn of the screw, if you would like, came with collaborative softwares like the one that you're mentioning, Slack, Teams. The shared, cloud environment has bring more agility in how we do, our regular business, reviewing documents, correcting Excel spreadsheets. I mean, you name it. But I don't think that that's necessarily the only thing, the channels in which we collaborate that drives really innovation and cross-fertilization that we're talking about. Some companies are already trying and experimenting with the establishment first of good core competencies, which is what we're doing in the OECD, reducing, what you want on people from a very, very varied set of behaviors to an understandable set of core behaviors that people can understand and that you can recruit from in the market. That helps from the substantive side. The other thing is, once people are in, there's a wealth of information about what people have done before coming to your company that we're not tapping to.
Yeah.
It's in there in the CVs, is in the way that people collaborate across Slack and all of these sources. And that's where, coming back to the question of AI, is can we in the future tap on the capacity of AI to look for people who have this knowledge and it's buried down there, so that we can prompt them and say, hey, you know about this. Can you join this team? Hey, you know about that other thing. We need this type of skill to solve this very difficult problem. That's where I see more the technological application of this going in the near future.
Yeah. Perry, have you got anything to say?
Yeah, I mean, I see that as almost like dynamic guilds, where you've got professional disciplines and it can bring people into them even if they're not kind of registered within that guild. Yeah, so I did some work with a tire company who wanted to have mass participation in their climate agenda. So they ran a series of hackathons, bringing people together from different disciplines to create ideas that could help. I mean, the harvest of ideas was just so abundant that they then had to make a choice about rank and priority. So that just shows you, when you give people the space, they want to do that. It isn't in the job description, but they want to do that. I'm with Daniel on this. The whole job description sometimes creates such a cage of confinement to what people do. So I'm much more into skills-based, role-based thinking, and people having the opportunity to kind of broadcast themselves and to tap into things that help them and help the company find new skills. So hackathons is just a great example of that.
So we're coming to the end now, and I just wanted to touch on mental health, which has become a huge issue in workplaces, but also particularly for HR people, as more and more is put on them. Do you have any advice for viewers, for themselves, but also for how best to tackle mental health issues within the workplace? Because since the pandemic, it really just keeps rising, doesn't it?
Right. And before the pandemic, well-being and mental health was buried down there within probably your common benefits function, and now it's become a principal problem of worry in the workplaces that even CEOs are paying attention to this, and I think it will continue to be. I think something has to be said about how do we create options for people to resolve this type of needs, these type of challenges. And the workplace, there is a responsibility of us as employers as well to create those spaces. We cannot solve every single problem that an individual has. We have to be conscious about it. But yes, create first safe spaces. We were talking about that before, in which people can seek help. Other types of things that we can do are more your run-of-the-mill, which is create also the right workflow so that burnout is not an issue to start with, so that support is also at hand, that people can do what they need to do and have the support that they need to do, and also that they seek the medical support if needed be at any point. And for that, you need a lot of conscientization from leadership to when the alarm bells are ringing on a staff member that might need additional help, and to act upon it, to reach out and to try to seek that help. I think that organizations need to create both that awareness, that leadership skill, but also those instruments to deal with it. And it's not going to go away, I think.
No. Perry,
That's so
what
well
are
put.
you finding?
Yeah, I think there's a problem in the way we look at, let's say, job design and the load balancing for that job that has the systemic aspect of a problem. And people are like, I'm in this job, I'm absolutely full pelt every day. I can't sustain this. So we need a way to do that. And again, I think technology can help us with how people are allocated work and how they find work and balance it themselves. But I think Daniel's points are right about how it needs to be kind of modelled. There's an absolute economic drain as well as a moral obligation if people are absent from work through stress and ill health that we've kind of inflicted on them by the conditions they're having to work in. So we've got to reverse that because it's costly and it is just immoral. So load balancing, role descriptions, alerts and support and punctuation is the thing for me. Days are brutal. Without punctuation, this thing that we call the brain is just worn out. And that's a danger sign.
So we're coming to the end. I just wanted to wrap up by asking you both for something you'd like to leave the audience with. Perry, could I start with you?
Yeah, I think just to that point, actually, I left you with that people talk about how do I manage time now because my diary's crunched and so on. I think the question to ask is how do I balance my energy? I would like to leave people with the thought that it's not a work-life balance, it's just a balanced life. So how can you bring that in as part of your strategy to cope? So manage your energy, not your time.
So just to pick you up on that, so work-life balance, do you think that's an outdated concept?
Yeah, I do.
So you'd say balance your
Balance life.
energy,
Balance
your life.
Yeah, balance life.
I like that very much.
Thank you.
Daniel.
Thank you. I like a lot this ending quote from Perry, so I'll write it out and
Oh, cool.
and keep it in my mind. I think that again, ending on a positive note on all the challenges ahead. I think that the future can be also good for a lot of the things that we do, a lot of the works that are out there. But if we take good care of ourselves, and if we incorporate all of this volatility, uncertainty, all of this complexity in the right manner into jobs and into people's capabilities to bring the best out of them. But then after that is done, it's also upon us as individuals to see, is this the right place for me to be in terms of an organization, in terms of a job, and take ownership of your own career. And have a growth mindset also as you own that career going forward.
And would that be for everyone or for HR professionals?
I think that's for everyone.
Yeah.
And is there a way in which the HR profession needs to change? Is just perhaps in one word, Perry, from what we've said now, I think the word is speed. Perhaps it's speed or adaptability.
Versatility. Yeah. I think that's something we've got within us, and we've almost like constricted ourselves with certain professional disciplines. I think we can show that we can be the most versatile part of any corporate function.
Like it, Daniel. How can we sum up how HR needs to be?
I agree to that. I think that we need to be masters of our trade, but also be the dot connectors that can go to all of the clients that we serve, to all of the people that we serve, and connect the dots so that they know where they may take the organization, where they may take their careers as well as individuals.
Brilliant. I love that. I had never thought of HR in that way before. They are the connectors.
Yep.
Thank you so much to you both.